Pinion Environmental Inc. logo, text lead and asbestos in historic buildings.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our CLG webinar for January, whatever month it is, first one of 2020. Thank you all for joining us, and it looks like we have a good crowd today. So as you all know, we have some special guests today, and I'm going to let them all introduce themselves because there's a nice slide for that. So yeah, you guys take it away. Go ahead. Oh, and one thing though, let's have you guys hold your questions for the end, or if you want to type them into the chat window, we'll answer them all at the end just so they can get through all the information that we want to cover. Begin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you everybody for coming online. We're excited to be here. My name is Tricia McCready, and I'm the Technical Group Manager for Industrial Hygiene with Pinion Environmental.
My name is Deborah Fernandez, and I'm an environmental scientist with Pinion Environmental. I do a lot with asbestos and lead.
And I'm Ashley Bushy. I'm the Technical Group Manager for Cultural Resources at Pinion Environmental, and do a lot with cultural resources and historic buildings, and work with this crew in coordinating with lead and asbestos in older buildings.
So we're going to keep this pretty informal, but we have a presentation for you. These are the topics we'll be covering for today, and I know there might be specific questions that might pertain to one of your scenarios that you have or an existing project you're working on, and we'll try to capture some of those questions at the end, but we'd also be happy to chat offline if there's anything we can help you with afterwards. Just a quick review, I mentioned we're all with Pinion. Deborah brings over 20 years of experience in asbestos and lead, predominantly. I work predominantly in the industrial hygiene field with about over 20 years of experience as well, but also in other areas of indoor air quality, mold identification and remediation help, various other air monitoring. And Ashley has just under 20 years of cultural resources experience.
Just under. 14
just under
now. Not that old, Trish.
Trying to make her, you know, as old as we are, right, Deborah?
Yes.
Anyway, so for our agenda today, we'll be focusing predominantly on lead. And when we talk about lead in historic buildings, it is lead paint. You may also know that there is obviously galvanized steel, piping, plumbing issues that contain lead. That won't be the focus of this webinar, but that's another topic for discussion. And we do have some information on that. We'll be running through 2 lead case studies of jobs that we have performed to kind of give you an idea of how we walked through that process. Same goes for asbestos. Asbestos in historic buildings. With both of those, we'll talk a little bit about the health implications and the regulations associated with it, and 2 case studies of projects we've worked on in the past regarding that. And then, as I mentioned, we'll open up for questions at the very end. So I think we'll go ahead and get started with me. Deborah, take it away.
Yes, I will take it away. We're going to talk just basically how lead and asbestos is common in historic buildings. EPA states that 87%, as you can read on this slide, that lead has been around since the 1940s, and it went up until, almost into the late 1960s before they started reconsidering to not use it any longer. In 1978, they actually banned the use of commercial use of lead-based paint. And then it can be found on, as Tricia just touched on, not only the galvanized steel, but it's a lot on the baseboards, the crown molding, windows, frames, and sills. It's very famous to find it there, and the doors and the door frames. I have found it on some walls. I can be in one room and test for lead-based paint on one wall, and then it's not on the other wall. But I can talk about that a little bit later. And then the asbestos has been around for a long time. It's a great product. In the historic buildings, it was mainly found on the old steam lines and the boilers. And then as asbestos use progressed, then it was in window glazings and skim coats and ceilings and like 2,700 or 3,000 products asbestos used to be used on. So we're going to go into lead in the historic buildings. And as we're aware, it's found on the doors, interior trims, exterior trims, windows. Although the focus of the webinar is based on lead-based paint, again, it's on other materials, and it's even found in soldering and I have found it on a lot of old utility sinks in some of these old historic buildings, and those sinks are gorgeous. So they do try to save them. And I wanted to say one more thing is that lead-based paint is not always white. These pictures are all in white, but it's green and brown and red. I get the point.
So I was just going to touch a little bit on the health implications of lead and why there are all these regulations surrounding it. Lead poisoning occurs when it starts to build up inside the body, and it takes months and years to accumulate within your body system. Predominantly, you'll see it in lead-contaminated dust or lead-based paint inside buildings, obviously a lot of them older buildings. And those happen to be the most common sources of lead poisoning in children. We've all heard the old adage of, don't let your kids eat paint chips. Well, that was because lead was a constituent of those older lead paint, or older paint that was used in buildings and houses along those lines. They're particularly high and hazardous to children because the younger the person, the higher increase of absorption of lead into their system. So they become sicker quicker than we adults do. Some symptoms in children include they may have been born prematurely. They could have developmental delays, vomiting, seizures, hearing loss. Unfortunately, it's a pretty dreadful list of conditions that might afflict these children. So keeping them out of children's hands and mouths is the biggest thing we can try to do. Regarding adults, it's also dangerous for us too. Again, we're the ones that are usually in our homes or buildings, and you'll find people, during renovation activities or disturbing lead paint, sanding or grinding. That's generally the way for exposure for adults. We don't generally ingest it on purpose like a child might do thinking it's candy. It's more inhalation or ingestion through fine particulates that become airborne throughout renovation processes, for example. That's if proper measures aren't in place to prevent that type of exposure. Symptoms in adults may include high blood pressure, miscarriage for pregnant women, obviously resulting in potential premature death of their baby, joint and muscle pain, abdominal pain, and also is linked to mood disorders. Some of the regulations that are in place to help prevent the exposure and the health hazards they're in place just for that reason alone. TSCA, or the Toxic Substances Control Act, Title IV of TSCA has information regarding lead-based paint and residential applications to it. So what we've listed on here, and we have this also available on our reference slide at the end of the presentation, EPA 40 CFR Part 745 gives you the description of what's considered lead-containing paint and what is lead-based paint. And it's based on a percent weight composition. So lower containing lead paint would be in the category of lead-containing paint, and then higher lead containing obviously would be lead-based paint. So you see the parameters of 0.06 up to 0.5 is lead containing, 0.5 and higher percent is lead-based paint. And there are regulations that focus on both lead-containing and lead-based paint. So just keep that in mind. Again, as Deborah mentioned, in 1978, lead-based paint was banned in residential housing by the federal government. EPA also has a regulation out there. It's EPA Title X, and it's in regards to child-occupied facilities, and they mean children under the age of 6. And it requires that tenants receive a brochure that talks about lead hazards associated with that particular environment that the child might be occupying or living in. I won't go into a ton of detail on this, but some additional regulations to consider. We have HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, I'm sure you all are very familiar with, along with the Secretary of Interior's, with their guidelines, in particular 36 CFR Part 68. I know a lot of you guys are very familiar with this regarding the preservation projects, especially ones that are SHF funded. In here, it also talks about the tax credits and design reviews.
These are our notes. Our notes are that SHF funded projects, tax credit projects, design review projects would be subject to the SOI standards.
Yes.
Yes.
So just to clarify that.
Experts on that.
Exactly. So you guys could teach me on that one a little bit more, but we listed it here for your guidance, which is perfect. EPA, the renovation repair and paint program. You'll see this a couple of times throughout our presentation today. It's also called the RRP program, and if you're not familiar about it, it's regarding if contractors are doing any type of remodeling or renovation, they have to have specific training for the RRP program. So they're not designed to permanently remove lead-based paint hazards. This RRP program is designed to guide and train contractors on how to handle it and what all is necessary in those types of renovation projects. CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, Reg 19, also is a very prominent regulation within Colorado regarding lead-based paint activities that are performed in target housing, child-occupied facilities, and buildings that will be converted to child-occupied facilities. So one of the biggest things to remember with lead-based paint is a lot of the regulations are focused on that child aspect of it because of the health hazard, the higher health hazard associated with children. Your daycares, your schools, those types of things really are a main focus and the reason why there are lead programs in place. Deborah.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of stabilizing or removing lead-based paint in the historic buildings and the historic fabric, especially the windows and interior and exterior trims. HUD and RRP projects will require, let me start that one over again. So before a contractor can start on these buildings, he has to have it tested. And then after they perform, let's say they're removing, or not removing windows, but let's say that they're performing RRP activities on the windows or the window sills, before they can have reoccupancy into this building, they have to have lead dust testing. So one of the challenges with that is because the dust is so light, an inspector like myself will go in, we take the lead white testing, and then we take it to a lab, and that takes about 3 days for results. If the results come back passing, that's great, but if they don't, that means that contractor has to go back in and clean every windowsill, every door. They have to clean the entire room, top to bottom, for the dust. So that's one of the challenges that they face during the RRP projects. And HUD, unfortunately, you've probably already come across this, HUD likes all their lead components removed and wish that they would change their mind a little bit, because there are some things that they could probably, that we can do to these, especially like windowsills.
So Deborah, if we had a window in a historic building that had a HUD project and the paint tested positive for lead, what would our options be with that window?
If it's going to be child occupied, they say it has to be abated.
So we can remove
You can remove the paint. So then that goes into an on-site challenge where I was just kind of leading to that you create the lead dust and then have all that testing. Or they can do off-site where they take that window out and they take it to another facility and they do all their magic on it and then they bring it back. So one of the things that I've seen done is they've taken a photograph, the abatement contractor. So it's usually, they work hand in hand. It's usually a general abatement, asbestos abatement contractor, and he is also, that company is also RRP certified or trained. So they'll take that window, but before they take that window out, they'll take pictures of it, every inch of that window, and then they label it. And then they take it off-site very carefully. And when it's off-site, then there's also somebody at the other end that's watching the work being done to repair and repaint this window, or even the door frames. I've seen door frames go out. They've been pretty tricky, but they've done it with a lot of care. Even then, when they bring that window back, and they also label it so they know where it fits, where it came from, because over time that window may not fit 3 windows opening down or that door. So they label that as well. But even when that window comes back, there's still testing in that room, just for any kind of latent dust. So those are two major challenges of lead in historic buildings.
So, and here I'm interrupting with the question too. But
That's okay.
I just want to be clear on that HUD requires that the lead-based paint be removed, not the window.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
It's just, often it's easier to remove the window.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
So the validation is in any dust remaining after the renovation or they removed it, that there is no lead dust present, which is what Deborah was talking about afterwards, regardless of if you're removing just the paint or removing the window itself.
Great.
And the other thing that will happen besides the testing inside the building is the inspector, the lead risk assessor or inspector actually has to go along the whole drip line, wherever those, if they were taken off site or repaired there, the inspector needs to take soil samples along what they call the drip line to make sure there aren't any lead-based or any paint chips in the soils. And if there is, then the contractor has to come back. The contractor has to come back and take 2 to 4 inches. I don't recall right at the moment if it's 2 inches or 4 inches that they have. I think it's 4 inches. They have to take at least 4 inches of soil away and then replace it.
We're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit more in one of the case studies. And speaking of, here's lead case study 1.
Yeah. This is such a beautiful building, and I'm so fortunate to have worked in so many historic buildings. This building shows that the paint is all white. Like I said earlier, it comes in different colors. So the lead-based paint on this was on the columns, the coins, the lintels, everything white here was lead-based paint, even those columns, the windowsills. So there was a general abatement, asbestos abatement contractor. I'll just refer right now, or further on as GACs, but they were also RRP trained. So they used heat guns to remove the slight chipping or peeling paint. And they did this so it protects the underlying historic substrate. You're not allowed, it says you're not allowed to do dry scraping, period. RRP does not, I have a little typo there. It says it's not advised, but it's not allowed. So RRP contractors are not allowed to do dry scraping because it creates the dust and it causes damage. So how the contractors did this, they worked on one side of the building at a time, and they erected their scaffolding. The scaffolding was erected so that it was 6 inches away from the building so it didn't touch the building. And then what they did, they took 6 mil poly, that's plastic, but it's 6 mil, so it's pretty thick. They took a fine bead of tape underneath those sills, and they would drape it to the scaffolding floor. So while they were using the heat gun and the vacuum any paint chips that could potentially fall to the ground. And they did, because it's a little windy sometimes in Wyoming. And actually, on really windy days, they were not allowed to work because the paint could not go anywhere. It wasn't allowed. Anyway, so they would drape this poly to the scaffolding floor to catch anything that they couldn't get with the vacuum. And again, like I said, it was a little windy, and sometimes that didn't work. And some of the paint chips did go into the soils below when I inspected, and we were out there with our little vacuum. They just vacuumed it right up, and they took some of the, because it wasn't soil, it was the chips.
Oh, like wood chips?
Like wood chips, right. So it was just easier to remove those wood chips, and they had one of those big vacuums. And then they had to replace the wood chips. But anyway, so they would work on just one side at a time. And when they were near completion of each side, like maybe they were 2 weeks out, I would go up there one or twice a week to check for damage, and then to check for any paint chips. And then when that one side was completed, then I also had to go back and check again for the soils below that. I think that covers how they did that on that list. So going into case study 2, again, I get to go to so many beautiful buildings. This building here needed an extensive asbestos and lead survey. And because of its historic value, the lead survey was done with an XRF. So that meant that I did not chip off any paint chips. I did it with one of those X-ray gun, fluorescent. Looks like an X-ray gun.
It's a handheld direct reading instrument that will show you the lead-based content of the paint. So it'll pull a value of a percentage, and you'll be able to compare it to see if it falls within a non-lead containing, lead containing paint, or lead-based paint.
Correct.
So immediately you have your results when you're doing a lot of surface area monitoring. So that is called an XRF as opposed to paint chips going in for analysis.
Right. And then just taking a paint chip sometimes is a little challenging. I actually walk around and I look for some place that has already got some wear on it so that I don't hurt the building any more than I need to. It's really hard to hurt these buildings. Like, oh.
Do you want to talk a little bit about discrete testing methods? No, we've talked about
that.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to, especially on the asbestos.
Okay.
Where I get kind of clever. I think I get clever.
You are clever, Deborah.
I think I try to be clever. During this inspection, what I'd like to what was different about this one was I had lead-based paint on some windows, and I had lead-based paint. I did not have lead-based paint on some windows. It was like a 50, I don't even know if it was 50-50. It was probably more not lead-based paint, and then the rest of them did have. And the reason why this happens is, so I walked into this building, I'm here all alone, and I'm looking around, and I see this one window, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this window's gorgeous. It's old, and it's gorgeous. And then I walk down to 4 or 5 windows further, and I'm like, well, they're changing. It's older. I mean, it's old, but it's not older like the first one I saw. And that's what goes through my mind. So I have to make sure that I test what I think is older and then old. And then I even test the new ones. But I didn't really see anything that looked new. I just saw something that looked not as old as the first window that I saw. And this also happened with the asbestos on the window glazing. I saw window glazing that definitely looked suspect to me. And then some that I thought, I don't know, I've got a 50-50 chance here. And that's exactly what happened. So not only were the windows half and half lead-based paint and half asbestos, I had to check almost every window because I had to mark which ones were lead-based paint on this project, because it was going to be child occupied at some point. So the contractor, again, was a different GAC and also RRP trained. So they did the RRP activities on the windows, and they were able to keep the asbestos window glazing in place. And the way that they did that was they took new window glazing and just made they smoothed it out. So if there, on the older windows, if there was some little potholes, little tiny potholes, or there was a piece of that asbestos glazing missing, they would just filled it in with the new glazing. And then they finished performing the lead-based paint repair. So they were able to keep everything in place. So when the project was all done, or they're still working on it, but when the project is all done, they will, because it has the potential to have child occupancy, they're going to need to give the tenants that brochure that it's lead-containing paint. In the corner, in this right-hand corner of this picture, was another interesting find of mine. So here your green paint is lead-based paint. To the left of the door, that tall wall was lead-based paint as well, the white. But to the right was not. So because it was not on one side and it is hot on the other side, I had to call that whole area lead-based paint. And so the only thing I could think of is maybe, because this was at the corner of the building, it was an older restaurant. Unfortunately, it had some fire damage in there as well. But I think maybe they had, who knows when, but at some point that concrete, that plaster was replaced, because it was zero on the XRF. There was no evidence of any lead-based paint there. So who knows when, 20 years ago, maybe he just took down that portion of the wall and put back up. And that's how that happens, and that's how that happens with the windows and door frames. You don't know when the renovations were. It's a family home, maybe. And, so many years ago, we repaired our own homes, and we didn't always replace it with lead-based paint.
So a good lesson that was had on this one was you have to obviously test more than just one area of what we call a homogeneous area or material. Check it multiple places for this reason alone, especially if you see any type of variation within the building materials, the windows, the windowsill, slight differences obviously can result in different information. So assuming it's not necessarily a good thing, you want to have the things tested and sampled for accuracy.
Right. And safety.
And safety, yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we're ready to go into a little bit about asbestos. Can we go back to that slide again?
Yes.
So at the top, this picture is actually a thermal insulation that you'll see in a lot of the historic homes or buildings. It's prevalent. And
It's in my house.
It's in your house now. So just to jump a little bit ahead, if it's in a part of the house, well, let's remember this picture. Some other places asbestos is commonly found. There's a good picture of the window glazing. That was not from that building, because that's a big chunk to repair. There's mastic or adhesive, we call it, and that it's underneath that floor tile, and sometimes that mastic, that adhesive is on like the original flooring. Plaster and lath and skim coat, you'll find the asbestos mostly in the skim coat. And then some of the historic buildings, they've, over the years, they've renovated, and they would put in ceilings, and then they would spray with asbestos acoustical ceiling material. And then again, we talked about how the asbestos insulation covers pipes and boilers.
So along the same lines with lead, obviously asbestos causes a health hazard for people. Asbestos is a carcinogen. It's not something we want to breathe in on any type of a routine basis. With asbestos, your primary exposure route of entry is through inhalation. And if you all recall, asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral. It's everywhere in the ground. Excuse me. And so when the fire retardant capabilities of asbestos were discovered, it became an amazing building material at the time, as you know. However, realizing through the years, it came with awful health implications. Therefore, it is something that you want to leave asbestos undisturbed as much as possible. What happens when you breathe in these fibers is they begin to accumulate in the lungs. And as your exposure increases, your risk of developing asbestos-related diseases increases as well. There is a latency period from the time of exposure to the time of the development of the disease. For that onset of disease, it's not an acute symptom, it's a very chronic infection where you don't know you have it for years and years. For example, some of the asbestos-related diseases, asbestosis is one of the ones you'll hear very often. That takes 20 to 30 years to actually show the onset of that disease. What happens there is after time, your lungs start developing scarring within the lung tissue. And there is no cure to rid your lungs of that scar tissue. You have a higher prevalence, actually you're 50 times more likely to develop lung cancer if you're an asbestos worker and you smoke. And that's just smoking a pack a day. So it's a synergistic effect. It makes the likelihood of you developing lung cancer that much more likely if you also work with asbestos. Another cancer, or the cancer that is associated with this, is mesothelioma. That one has a longer latency period of 30 to 40 years to develop. So a lot of these people that worked with asbestos earlier on in their career could be retired now, have no idea, and all of a sudden they're developing mesothelioma, which was from exposure from years and years ago. Again, asbestos is the primary cause of that particular cancer. And this one is characterized by tumors in the tissue that appear between the lung and the diaphragm. And this cancer is nearly always fatal. So you don't want to mess around with asbestos exposure too much. There are quite a few regulations, asbestos regulations. We highlighted some of the main ones here that are pretty interesting. We mentioned before with lead-based paint, in 1978 with asbestos, the EPA banned the use of sprayed applied surfacing materials like that acoustical sealing and various fireproofing that was sprayed applied. In 1989, there was just a partial ban on the manufacture, the import, and the processing of some asbestos-containing materials. I think there's a misnomer out there. Everybody thinks, oh, well, asbestos is illegal. You can't get it anymore. Well, that was the intent, was to no longer allow it. But they did have a grace period for quite some time where contractors were able to use up their supply of materials well past this 1989 date. So you want to be very careful not to just use the age of a building when something was constructed to make that determination of, well, it's asbestos containing or it's not. So a lot of caution with that. Reason being, if you look at the next line, as recently as April of 2019, there was another final ruling ensuring that asbestos products that are no longer on the market and haven't been, they had to make a ruling saying that it cannot be resold and brought back into the United States and put back on the market because it is being used in other countries. So you have other countries that use it all the time still, trying to then resell it back to the U.S. So this particular ban was to help eliminate that possibility of happening. Obviously, they indicate that without the EPA reevaluating the asbestos product and its use. For those of you that have worked in public school buildings or in other larger buildings,
Like, yeah, even with the public buildings, the charter schools, like some of the older, some historic buildings are changed into charter schools, and they have a whole set of rules under the AHERA as well in EPA.
so yeah, this 1986 AHERA, or the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, required the EPA to make it mandatory for schools to be inspected for asbestos-containing materials and to develop a management plan of how to either keep it in place or abatement processes. And they will go back in every few years, is it every 3 years? You'll go back and do a AHERA inspection to re-inspect a building that has known asbestos in place.
Correct.
To make sure that the condition of it is still considered intact and not friable.
That's correct.
In 1990, ASHARA, which is Asbestos School Hazard Abatement Reauthorization Act, 1990, that was developed, and that helps with funding for abatement loans and grant monies for schools, public buildings, and commercial buildings to help deal with their asbestos. And again, HUD is also involved with asbestos and lead, particularly Chapter 9, Section 9.3, where that gives information regarding the managed care of buildings that are containing asbestos. So there are a lot of regulations out there, but for good reason. Some additional regulations to consider, obviously in addition to the federal compliance, state by state, agency by agency, the treatment of these types of hazardous materials need to be considered. So here in Colorado, CDPHE, again, they have a wonderful regulation. It's called Regulation 8 through their Air Quality Control Commission. They ensure that general contractors and general abatement contractors require the rules that are listed within Regulation 8. And certified asbestos building inspectors like Deborah and other folks, that is what they are there to do, is to collect samples, do monitoring, and make sure everything is following, and the contractors are following the guidelines set forth within Regulation 8. I don't need to tell you guys about the Secretary of Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties. You guys know all of that information. But that obviously is another regulation to consider in addition to the federal regulations.
And I'm up again. So there are some challenges with asbestos in historic buildings. Anytime a contractor wants to do any kind of renovation, and not just in historic buildings, but commercial buildings, even when these general contractors want to go into somebody's home and maybe take out, and it's not historic, but I'm just trying to tell you they have to follow that Regulation 8, and those materials and that are going to be affected need to be tested before renovation. If they're not, and it's asbestos, that general contractor will get a hefty fine, could possibly get a hefty fine for not having an inspection done first. So with that, testing some of these buildings, it's really difficult to get access to them, or asbestos can be in so many different little nooks and crannies, and you're in a historic building, and you have to do plaster. Well, plaster crumbles. It's very hard. So what we recommend is having an inspector that can be very discreet, can perform discreet inspections and bulk sampling. And this is where I think I'm clever. So one of the things that I do, especially around plaster, or even, when I know that I need to be very discreet, the outlets, your light outlets, I'll just take a knife and very carefully score around the outside of that plastic or wood, whatever that outlet has. And then I take that outlet, that cover off, and I know my boundaries. So plaster's pretty hard to get without crumbling all over, and then you have power, so I do have to be very careful in taking the smallest little, it's going to sound awful, but I take the smallest little chisel that I have and tap with the hammer inside that boundary that I have, lightly scored around there. Another place that I go is underneath sinks, way in the back where it's low visibility and nobody can see that I've even been there. They'll see it on my floor plans when we give them the report. But one of my favorite places is I actually will find a closet, because I'm required to take, 5 to 7 samples of plaster in a building. So I try to find places, maybe it's already damaged, maybe there's a little damaged area, so I'll just go over there and get a little piece. But one of the other things that I can do, if that's not available, is I walk into a closet. So I walk into a closet, and then I immediately turn around, and the wall that has the door opening, I will get on a ladder and go way up high. So a lot of times, there are usually higher ceilings, and I've never heard of anybody saying, oh, I didn't even know you were there. They can never tell I was there. They never find me. And if they do, then I guess they just maybe plug it up, or I will patch a little bit on my way out. So that's one of the challenges about being a building inspector when it comes to historic fabrics. Another thing is, Tricia had mentioned, we have the school-specific regulations. And again, AHERA requires that child-accessible areas containing friable asbestos, and that would be like your acoustical ceilings, or a long time ago we had the gyms with the sprayed applied insulation in the gym ceilings, and so they had to take all that, has to be removed. Anytime that there's any what we call that picture of the piping, if maybe a piece of that piping is in a classroom, this is an older building, changed into a charter school usually, I have found right there at the heater registers, there's just that little bit of piping that's coming up from the floor into that register. That has to be abated, because that child could go over there and kick it, pick it, who knows what kids do, but so that has to be removed. So that's what I mean by child accessible. But when they remove, let's say they have floor tile, and the floor tile is in good condition, they can leave that there under this AHERA. But it has to be managed like Tricia was saying earlier, it has to be managed every 3 years. So an inspector like myself goes in, we have a plan, we know where all the asbestos is remaining in place, and we have to make sure that it's still in place when we leave. And then one of the last things, any remaining asbestos that's identified in a building that's had renovation, maybe it's even trying to take it back to its natural state or its original state, its historic state.
I like that natural state.
Okay, I like natural state too. So maybe it's that window glazing. If that window glazing remains in place, then it needs to be put on the as-built. If any asbestos remains in place, it needs to be put on that as-built, and that's for the protection of future contractors or somebody else, doing repairs to the building, even the owners. Maybe it's a new owner, maybe it's a new residence. They have an older home, they know they have asbestos, but it should be put on those as-built, because if they sell it, it's disclosure. Yeah.
And Deborah, I think everybody knows what friable means, but if you're trying to picture what friable asbestos is,
I did throw that out there, didn't I?
that's okay. Let's just tell them that,
So friable asbestos is a material, asbestos-containing material that you can crumble with your hands. Non-friable asbestos would be the floor tile that you cannot crumble by hand, and that's how that's classified for school, for anywhere. So we're going to jump right into case study 1. And this is, again, I've just had so many wonderful experiences in my career, and one of them was playing around in the Rocky National Park. Many buildings, they actually have, Rocky Mountain National Park has an asbestos and lead-based paint management program. So they have, well, they have their inspections. They don't do their inspections. So they call for somebody to come out and do their asbestos and lead inspections. And then what they do is, especially for their lead, they actually have, they have a group of men in their maintenance department that are RRP trained. So they can go and maintain these windowsills and the storm windows. Storm windows are like 30% lead-based paint.
Wow.
They're so high in lead. But they go every year. They check them out. They go through the whole park. It's like they just keep going. They go throughout the park and then they go again. And they'll perform the RRP activities on the lead. But the asbestos in this particular building, they knew that they had floor tile in there, and they wanted to bring it back to the natural state. So I was and I was like, okay. And I was looking around for a place that I could be discreet, and I was told, you don't have to be really discreet, just don't hurt the floor. Okay. So one of my challenges was to dig through this really hard, and I went to a seam, and it looks like it could be easy from that destruction that I did, but this floor tile was so hard. My little chisel and hammer, which sounds so painful, I had a hard time, and I was really nervous because I didn't want to put even a nick in the floor. And then I discovered this weird fabric that I had not seen before, because it's usually floor tile and then mastic, the adhesive, the black adhesive or brown adhesive. But I came across that fabric, and it made it all the more difficult for me to dig down and get to, I have to go all the way to the floor. I'm supposed to take all layers. I am required by the state to take all layers of materials. So I had to keep digging, and it looks like I made a horrible mess, but really I can be discreet. But we purposely put this in there because the adhesive, which turned out to be asbestos, was between the floor tile and that meshing. And I put this as a case study because what would have happened if that adhesive was on the floor itself. The general contractor can still come in and remove this floor tile and that meshing. It's probably old carpet, and they just left that bottom of that carpet. But the asbestos contractor could come in. They use heat guns to remove this floor tile. They'll have to be careful because of the meshing. But they're also they can be talented too. But what I'm trying to say is that asbestos adhesive had been on the wood, they have a product called Beanie. It's called Beanie Doo. And it's a funny name, but it doesn't hurt. It removes the mastic with quite a bit of elbow grease, but it does not hurt the flooring below. And so afterwards, they can refinish that flooring to make it look in its natural state. But the inspector does have to watch them. When this was done, there was a window for the parks service people to come in and watch them. I mean, they didn't go into the containment, but they could watch from outside that they weren't damaging this floor. So I didn't have an actual picture of this. So this is a scenario. This plaster has, what I'm trying to say is I didn't have an actual picture of the abatement or the repair of this. I have where the plaster has fallen away from the wall here.
This is also my house.
Anyway, so so the asbestos, it had to have an inspection for asbestos, and we're saying that the skim coat there was tested hot for asbestos or positive for asbestos. So the general abatement contractor will put this single room under abatement, under containment, not the entire house. The wall can be repaired. Not all the walls have to come out. This is important, I think is important to know. You don't have to take out all the walls to fix a portion of a wall. Unless the damage, maybe the damage to the lath is just, you have to do it. But it does not have to do, you don't have to do that. You can just abate and repair what you need. You can keep the rest of the walls. So what they would do is they would build a containment, and that would require some poly outside covering the door, all the seams. It has to be airtight. They have a negative air machine, and they have an entry, and then they have a decon. So it's a full abatement. And what they would do is they come in and they would just remove all that loose plaster, and they would remove it back to maybe the next vertical stud so that they can tie in with new plaster. And a lot of times the repair or the tie-in is done by a plaster specialist. There are some general contractors that have some pretty talented guys that can do this, but then you have your specialist as well. So after they remove the loose plaster and damaged plaster, then there's an air monitoring test that will show that it's good for re-entry again, that there's not any asbestos fibers in the air. And then they'll take down their containment, and then that's when the specialist can come back and repair that, or the GAC can repair it too. A little note, and it's also on this slide, is that the lath may test hot, and that's because sometimes when they're building this and they're using the asbestos skim coat, can get on that wood lath. They can also, if there's a worry, they can also take this abatement contractor, so this is before the containment comes down, the abatement contractor can apply like a light surfactant, and that keeps any fibers intact on that wood. And then when they put that plaster on, the new plaster, because that new plaster is wet, you have a coating of surfactant on this wood, so chances of an exposure are pretty slim to none when they do that. And then again, when this is all complete, the as-built will still need to show, maybe if they just did a partial wall, the as-built to show 4 feet from ceiling, 4 feet from ceiling to, no, I'm sorry, 4 feet from floor up is new plaster, non-asbestos, but maybe from ceiling to, it's an 8-foot wall. 4 feet down is plaster containing asbestos. So it should show on that wall. And that would be, again, for anybody that's coming in. And that's actually happened to me. was doing an inspection, and I'm like, oh, this is drywall. Oh, this is plaster. And I don't know what possessed me, but I went up to the ceiling. For some reason, I decided to go up to the ceiling and test, and it was plaster. I'm like, so it does happen where there's new plaster, or well, not in this case, but they took the plaster out on the whole width of the wall and then put in drywall and attached it to the plaster. That's what happened. But again, it's important to make sure that's on the as-built.
Here is a list of a lot of the references that we referred to and came across during the research of this. Many of you probably already know a lot of these links, but we just kept these links in there for your reference and information. We did notice that the National Park Service links, their website is under maintenance right now, so a lot of these are not active links. You may know this if it said, sorry, we're reconstructing our website at the moment, but that is a place where you can find this information of these references. So please use these at your convenience when you need to. And I think we are now at the point where we can open it up for questions that might be coming in. So Erica.
Okay, so we have our first question here. What funding is available for lead or asbestos testing remediation in historic buildings? Is there funding available for any building regardless of historic status? And so I can answer the question about historic buildings, but what about regardless of historic status? You know, you guys mentioned one program, I think, for the schools.
Right, the AHARA.
Right. I remember in my research for the historic and HUD, again, there was a HUD guidelines has like 18 chapters. And I recall one of those chapters said something about funding, but again, that's going to be for removal if it's HUD and lead-based paint. If it's HUD and asbestos, depending on what the building use is going to be for, I don't recall, I didn't read all 18 chapters. I don't recall if there was funding for, maybe it was
the testing, yeah.
Oh, for the testing. I don't know about testing. I did not read anything in my review for historic buildings and testing specifically. It was for the renovation only that I saw funding for.
Okay.
That answers your question, sorry.
Well, and the nice thing is for historic buildings, you know, if you were going to do a project funded through the State Historical Fund, that is a cost that can be included because obviously they want you guys to do that testing ahead of time. And,
okay.
You know, possibly the abatement could be included in that as well. So in my experience, most grants that we see for historic buildings, that's an allowable cost to, because obviously we want to make the building useful.
You're right. I did see something about the abatement and some funding for that.
And it's a minimal cost compared to the cost of an abatement. But again, caution that any cabbie or inspector that you have that comes out, that they have worked in historic buildings before and do perform discrete testing. You're going to see a wide variety of probably quotes and prices associated with that. And this would be, it would be in your best benefit to do your due diligence to do a little background work on the inspector to make sure they understand the special implications of your historic building, as opposed to someone walking in and taking a hammer to the center of your wall. That's not necessary to take the sample there.
No.
You can follow the measures that Deborah had indicated of being very discreet. Our goal at Pinion is to make it look like no one was ever there, even though we collected 75 samples. So it can be done. It takes time. Time is money, but so is your project and so is your building. So you want it restored as best as you possibly can. So keep that in mind as well.
So, and if you guys have questions, don't forget you can just type them into the chat window, or you're welcome to unmute yourselves and ask on the phone. And while we wait for them to chat, to put them in, I have some other questions.
I have some questions too. Go ahead.
Okay. So you know, one thing that our CLGs hear a lot is people will come in and be like, I have asbestos or I have lead, so I have to replace my windows. I have to demolish this building. You know, stuff like that. It's always, they're like, we have to do this and there's no other option. But based on what you guys are telling us today, that doesn't seem to be the case. Is that?
That is correct. It is
Okay.
not the case. Like, on that last scenario, it was a partial wall. And they put back plaster, and they did not have to take out the whole wall, all the walls. They didn't. You don't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Windowsills and windows. If it's not, it gets a little tricky if you have those windows that slide and they have the lead weights and
In the window wells.
like in the window wells, and it gets a little tricky if you have children under the age of 6 and it's, you know, then you have the EPA and it's child occupied and stuff like that. If you maintain your windows and it's your home, you maintain those windows like once a year, put on that thin coat of non-lead paint, you're maintaining it. You don't have to remove those windows.
Keep in mind with the asbestos, it's
Or doors.
the quality of the asbestos being left in place. Is it friable material? Is it in damaged condition? Is it in good condition? If you're walking by it, will you disturb it? Something like that. That also determines on a case-by-case basis, oh, this area should be abated for asbestos because of the damaged condition. You're just better off abating it, removing it, and then starting over, or leaving it in place if the integrity of it is still intact.
Mm-hmm.
So just because it comes back asbestos does not mean it has to be removed. There are certain circumstances, and it really is a case-by-case basis, but that's where you can get an inspector to help you make those determinations and have those discussions with your general abatement contractor and your general contractor.
And if a building's going to be demolished and that decision's already been made, the asbestos has to be abated, removed before the building can be demolished. It's
Correct.
not necessarily
That is correct.
making it easier to just say
No.
we're going to demolish the entire building.
No, it has to be removed first.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's another, I think, myth that we hear a lot. And so, okay. So we have another question. It is, if a house is being listed for foundation work, is there a requirement that all lead and asbestos in the house has to be removed? So in this case, they're telling this person that all of the interior walls have to be removed because of the asbestos in the plaster. And I think we kind of just answered this, but so this is exactly the kind of thing that people are being told.
Yeah.
And
I don't see why they need to be removed unless it's structurally going to be unsound.
Mm-hmm.
I've not been part of a project where they've lifted.
But yeah, again, if it's not going to be disturbed, if it's
Right.
intact,
I don't see.
they can abate certain areas. One thing to keep in mind is if they have to, here's something with lead paint. If you're going to cut, grind, weld, or do anything to a lead paint surface, couple of things to keep in mind. You still have to have the paint tested, but then whomever is performing that construction or renovation, that is a potential exposure for that employee, not so much the home occupant or the building occupant, but the OSHA, the workers need to be protected under OSHA to make sure when they're performing that renovation, they are not being exposed. If there is that potential for exposure, then the proper personal protective equipment or PPE needs to be worn. But that would be the only case if you know you're going to be cutting or grinding if something that's going to be left in place. But
I really have not heard of that type of scenario. I know that if they need to remove a structural wall, maybe they have to remove a structural wall when they're lifting. Then if that wall needs to be everything needs to be inspected for asbestos if it's going to be part of lifting that house. So if they have to remove especially if they have to remove a wall, a structural wall, they have to test for it if it is asbestos, and they have to remove that wall. That also has to, the CDPHE has to be notified of those kinds of renovations. But I've not heard that they've had to remove
Yeah.
So,
just because they're lifting a house.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like they should want to ask the contractor, you know, let's see your inspection report, like,
Yeah.
let's see the proof that there is lead in all these walls that you have to remove, and why do you have to remove them? Are they damaged? Are they going to be damaged
Right.
because of the lifting of the foundation? So
That's a good question.
yeah,
That's a really good
and
question.
that's a good point, kind of, for all of these. You know, when you guys are told stuff by contractors, by property owners, always ask those questions. Like, okay, they're saying that it's going to cost this much, or that you have to do this, or that this contains lead or asbestos. Okay, great. Let's see your report. Let's see your estimate. You know, those are things that, if they're saying this, they should already have that information available to you. You're not, you know, asking them for anything extra. So that's a great thing to ask when people are bringing these things to you.
Especially maybe during the renovations, it's only affecting 2 walls.
Yeah.
Why, you don't need to go through the cost of removing the other 2 walls.
Right.
You're just
What's
taking
gonna
out
be
these 2 walls.
Impacted by the renovation. If it's not going to be impacted and you're leaving 2 walls in place, you've got asbestos in the skim coat, that can be left in place as long as it's not going to be disturbed or damaged during the renovation happening on the other side of the room.
So one might ask, well, I'm removing 2 walls, they're attached to the asbestos ceiling. Well, if they have to abate those 2 walls, they can take a bead, a portion of that ceiling, and they can abate that texture or that plaster. They can take that bead off, you know, like a 1 foot, so they can retie back into it.
So there's all kinds of options.
There are
It's
options.
just, and that kind of, you know, that's how we do historic preservation too. Like, it's always, there's never a black and white answer.
Right.
It's always, there's always like 5 different approaches that you can take to save money or to achieve the same goal.
And a lot of times you'll find that those contractors, most of those contractors can really think out of the box and say, okay, we understand the importance that you want to keep this all intact. We'll just have them take the 2 walls or that top portion of that ceiling so we could tie back in.
And ask your contractor those questions, just like you're saying, Erica, and ask to see the report. The asbestos and lead sampling report what we do when we generate our reports, and it's part of CDPHE's Reg 8 law, is we have to show photos, show exactly where the asbestos-containing and lead-containing materials are, the quantities of them, if you have it only in a certain part of the room. So ask to see that report, and you can help be part of the understanding of why do we have to remove all of this if it's only in this area, how come? So don't be afraid to address those questions and ask them to, I don't want to say challenge them, but ask them to explain the reasoning for their direction that they're giving you as far as abating everything. Why? Ask them why, and maybe the inspector who performed the sampling can call up whomever did that report. They can give information as well on the materials contained within that. We get a lot of calls back from reports we've done asking more particular questions about it. Don't be afraid to do that as well.
So Tricia was just hitting on something on our reports. If I have plaster lath containing or asbestos containing plaster and lath, I have to say it's on all walls. If it looks the same, if it's the same, if the texture looks the same from room to room, I say it's on. I say it's throughout. But if it's and maybe that's where they're getting confused, because the report might say the asbestos plaster lath throughout the house. But maybe maybe there's a different, and it's probably true. If you start finding it in 1 or 2 rooms, it's usually prevalent throughout the whole house. So maybe they misinterpret the report to say, well, throughout the whole house, everything has to come out. But when in fact, it really just needs, if you only need those affected walls to go down. for some reason.
Okay.
So it might be a misinterpretation of how they're reading the lab results of the report.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just get that clarification.
Right.
Okay. That's all the questions on here, but you had some too.
I had a question about the XRF, the fluorescent testing,
Mhm.
which sounds much more non-invasive
Correct.
than traditional paint chip testing. I wondered if you could speak to the cost differential.
So it depends on how many samples you're
Yeah.
going to collect, right, Deborah?
Right.
And an XRF, generally, if you rent it, the CABI inspector, or, you know, our inspectors, it generally will cost you about $500 a day. And a general lead paint chip sample
It's about 10.
is about $10 to $15 a sample.
A sample.
A sample.
Okay.
So you have $500 for this XRF where you could hit hundreds of surfaces. And if you wanted to collect lead paint samples, if you want to do hundreds of lead paint chip samples, number one, it would take days and days to do that. You'd really want to focus on certain areas. So
it could be cost effective.
it could be cost effective depending on the size of the building, how many painted surfaces there are in there, how many different painted surfaces. If you have like 10 different colors of paint in there, you need to have each of those colors of paint analyzed. So it's something to talk about with your inspector prior to a sampling event.
It is. I mean, that paint chip sample is supposed to be I think it's a 2-inch by 2-inch square. So that's why when I am doing that kind of testing where I'm not using the XRF, I do look for damaged areas, even if it's in a closet. Because it's supposed to be about a 2 by 2 inch. On that one building on the Trinidad, I think I took over 300 shots in that building.
Meaning with the XRF.
With the XRF,
Mhm.
and pretty much took a day.
Yeah,
Just the lead testing took one whole day.
with the XRF.
With the
yeah.
XRF.
Mhm.
Which would have been, what, $3,000 if you had done paint chips for each of those
Right.
surfaces. Okay, so depending on your.
And I too have to be careful when I'm taking these when I physically take the lead-based paint chip samples. I try to make sure that I haven't left anything on the ground. You know.
It's safer potentially too.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Keep in mind, you do have, there's training that's involved in operating the XRF.
Yeah.
It's not something that, you know, you're going to find at Home Depot and grab off the shelf and anybody can go take an XRF. So you do want to have someone trained using it. So keep that in mind when you're asking for assistance in your lead inspections to be performed in your facilities. It's a great tool, but it has to be utilized correctly.
I think if you go to rent them, I don't think just anybody can rent them, because they always ask, have you been trained in nighttime? Yes, I have.
So,
Cool.
good question.
Do you have another one?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. And we don't have any more on there, but so talking about testing costs, so for asbestos, those have to be sent to a lab, those samples. Do you guys have an average cost for what one sample of asbestos would, well, not of asbestos, but.
Oh, sure, of material.
Hopefully not asbestos. How much that would cost?
Yeah, your average asbestos sample, it depends on the turnaround time that you want from the lab. Obviously, the sooner you want those results back, the more expensive the analysis is. But generally, a week turnaround time. Is it about $20 a sample, Deborah?
It's pretty close to that.
Yeah, but again, you have the labor involved in collecting it, and then a lot of the time that is taken to analyze the lab results that come back, formulated into the report. But just the actual physical sample itself is about $20, and then all the labor and reporting costs on top of it. So you could find, I'm trying to throw out a general cost of a residential asbestos and lead sampling event, let's say a 2,500 square foot house, maybe 50 asbestos, 10 lead samples, reporting information might be around $5,000 to $10,000 for a sampling if I'm remembering correctly.
Is it?
I think around $5,000 is for a smaller scale. But that we can, that's certainly something we could give you a better
It's another one.
estimate.
It depends.
It depends.
Right,
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can go in and ask for just specific walls.
Right,
Like-
just for the work
Oh,
that
yeah,
you're going to be
Yeah.
doing.
Called a
is that-
limited sampling event.
Yeah, you would, and then that's different than having a full inspection. I mean, when we do a full asbestos inspection and lead inspection, it's your ceiling, it's your roof, it's your attic, it's your crawl space, it's your basement, it's everything in
Pretty
between.
comprehensive.
Yeah.
It's really comprehensive.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think we've gone, probably gone way over. So if no one else has any questions.
I'll also mention, if you think of a question at a later time, at the beginning of the slide, we have our email addresses on there.
Oh,
Please
okay.
shoot us an email and ask any question, and we'll try to answer it as best we can. But again, as we all know, it's a case-by-case situation, but more general information, we'd be happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
Oh, that's great. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this for us, because I know this is a topic that they all deal with, and so to have the experts here is very helpful. And so everyone, I'll share this PowerPoint with you guys on the CLG training portal, along with the recording of this, in case you have other folks on your commission that couldn't join us today. And just a couple of reminders, your CLG grants are due in about 4.5 hours. No, 3.5 hours. So make sure you send those in, and be sure to join us next week. We're going to be doing another webinar, so 2 in January, on sustainability and historic preservation. And then, of course, we have the CPI conference coming up at the end of the month. So please make sure you register for the mock Historic Preservation Commission hearing. That's going to be a lot of fun, and I need you to register ahead of time so that I know who to expect. All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and we will hopefully see you next week. And
Thank you.
thank you.